Hi everyone, I hope you're having a peaceful day. Today's story begins with silence, the kind that hides both comfort and danger. While Officer Lee is still far away on his secret mission, Sam continues her quiet days at home, tending her garden and waiting for his call. But somewhere beyond the valley, a man from her past has just walked free, and his shadow is moving closer. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next episode of Sam and Lee. The prison gate coughed open like a throat-clearing winter from its chest. Kai stepped out in a washed-out uniform that no longer knew his shape, elbows thinned, the color somewhere between gray and smoke. 2 years had hung over him like a blade. He drew a long breath of air that smelled like cold iron and damp concrete, as if the world might cut him cleaner on the way out than on the way in. An old wave motorbike idled by the curb, seat patched with tape, headlamp fogged with scratches. The man on it, half friend, half shadow, tossed a cheap faux fur jacket without ceremony. "Cold," he said. "Put it on." Kai's fingers shook as he cupped a cigarette to the lighter. The first drag burned a path through his throat, turning into a pale ribbon that got lost in morning mist. He didn't look at the man when he spoke. "You know what eats me most?" His voice came out gravel, like his mouth had been chewing yard dust all night. "Sam. She said my name. That's why I did my time." The man's mouth found a smile that wasn't kind. "Revenge is easy. You want a road? Come with me to Black Dragon. Money for both pockets. No one asks questions you can't answer." Kai glanced at the pale mountains, at a morning not finished being born. Ash fell from his cigarette and landed like a tiny grey snow. He didn't reply. He climbed onto the bike. They dropped down the pass in tight curls, the road folding and unfolding like a paper thought. Wind lifted the jacket collar and bit his ears numb. Each curve turned up the same sentence in his head: "I will find you, Sam." The valley wore winter like a grudge, close and without apology. Tin roofs hunched, shop fronts yawned themselves awake. Dogs raised their heads and decided it wasn't worth it. The man pulled up to a tea stall under a slanted tin awning, the counter nicked by every kind of fist. Steam lifted from a dented kettle and made quick ghosts of them as they sat. "Drink," the man said, sliding over glasses that burned your fingers the second you held them. Kai let the heat bite. The tea hit bitter first, then sour, like a lemon that had learned bad manners. He kept his eyes on the road, just a thin river of dust between houses. "I need work," he said, "and cash." "You need a name that opens doors," the man answered. "Black Dragon opens every door this side of the border. We run at night. We don't go empty. You say yes. You sleep in a room that's yours again." Kai rolled the cigarette between thumb and forefinger, as if weighing his future in paper and ash. He thought of the night Sam spoke his name to people who could write it on metal and close it behind him. That sound had followed him into sleep and back out again for 2 years. He didn't say any of this out loud. He only nodded once, like a hinge turning in the dark. The man's smile said he'd won a bet. "Good. Tonight you listen. After that you decide how fast you want to climb." Kai didn't add anything. The decision sat beside his lungs, hot as the tea. He finished the glass, set it down, and watched the steam slip away as if it were the last warm thing he owned. The wooden house kept its own small weather. Wind pressed its cheek to the windows and sighed along the eaves. Frost crusted the path to the coop and made the trellis look like lace. Sam pulled her coat tighter and stepped into the garden, breath curling white ahead of her. Work steadied her, the kind that keeps hands busy so the heart can learn how to be quiet again. She loosened the soil in the nesting boxes and laid down fresh straw. She shook the water tray, flicked out a thin coin of ice, and set it back. The hens muttered private arguments, scolding the cold as if it could hear and change. She checked the spinach, trimmed a yellowing leaf, pressed dirt back around a stubborn green stem. When you pay attention, the world is almost always doing its best to go on. Footsteps sounded on the lane, careful, light. Comrade Duck's silhouette appeared at the gate with a bundle balanced in both arms. "Saplings," he announced, nudging the latch with his elbow. "And eggs, the good kind." Sam laughed, the small kind that warms a place more than a fire does. "You're a rescue," she said, taking the bundle and setting it on the step. The shells clucked softly against one another, a domestic music that made the wind feel less sharp. Dirk gave the garden an inspector's serious once-over. "Another week and you'll be bargaining with half the village." She nodded, and the nod caught on something. The question rose before she could tuck it away. "Duke," she asked, steady but softer, "have you heard from Lee?" His hand went to his phone before his eyes did. "Let's try," he said. They moved closer to the window where reception usually behaved. Sam rubbed warmth into her palms and watched the screen like it was a door that might open if you stared kindly enough. The kettle ticked on the stove. Outside, light thinned and brightened by turns, a winter habit she had started to love. Evenings slid around the edges of the slopes and broke into thin ash. On the far side of town, Kai stood in front of a 2-story brick house that smelled of wet cement and someone else's life. He recognized the gate's line, but not its paint. The flowers were wrong. "She lived here?" he asked. The old woman next door leaned on her broom. "Long time ago," she said. "Sold the place, moved somewhere quiet, no one's heard." Kai stared at the new paint, like the right answer might dry on top of it. The man who'd brought him down the pass touched his sleeve. "Come on," he said. "Eat, you look half dead." Kai let himself be steered away, shoes scraping grit off the slope. The road bent toward the river. Rust and silt lifted in the air, a memory of metal and slow water. He kept his eyes ahead, but a picture had already formed that wouldn't leave. A small wooden house, a rough path to a coop, someone's careful hands making ordinary life hold. Back at the wooden house, Duke's thumb hovered over the call button. He tilted the phone up as if height could invite a voice home faster. The signal icon wavered, caught, and then the speaker filled with a breath. "Sam?" Lee said. His voice came through distance and static, and still landed right in the middle of the room. "I'm all right." Something inside her unclenched all at once and turned to water. She pressed a palm to her eyes and found the other hand searching for the table's edge. "The garden's almost ready," she said, letting the words stand up one by one. "The hens will lay soon." "Wait for me," he murmured, the edges of his voice worn by wind. "I'll be back to put my arms around you." It didn't sound like a promise so much as the prayer he'd been repeating to stay the same person on the other side of the night. Sam smiled through tears that blurred the room into a tender shape. "I'll wait," she whispered, sending the word carefully across the distance. The line trembled, A thin veil of static pulled across his breath. "Signal's poor," he said, "but I'm here." The connection thinned to quiet. The kettle's soft clicks returned. The house shifted in the wind the way old houses do, settling without complaint. Duke turned away so the walls could manage a privacy they weren't built for. "I'll set the saplings by the fence," he said, already moving. Sam followed him to the door. The light outside had that winter softness that makes everything seem closer. She knelt and pressed her fingers to the soil. It answered, in the way soil does, by receiving without argument. "Grow," she told the rouse, embarrassed by the tenderness in her own voice. The word left her like a breath you hold for someone else until they can take it back. She stood and looked down the lane. Beyond the hedge, somewhere past the bend where the road forgets its name, a figure watched the roofs in patient silence. Sam didn't notice. She gathered the eggs, checked the latch, and carried the small music of shells inside, turning waiting into a quiet kind of strength. The yard had fallen quiet again after Duke left. The gate closed with a soft click, and the sound drifted away into the wind. Sam stayed there for a while, crouched by the rows of green, her fingers still buried in the soil, as if the earth itself could steady her pulse. The winter air carried a thin scent of smoke from someone's distant cooking fire. She pressed her palm against the soil once more. It was cool, firm, real, something she could trust. "Grow," the word left he. When she finally stood up, the stiffness in her knees reminded her of how long she'd been there. She brushed the dirt from her palms, then from her coat, slow and deliberate, as though wiping off the last of her fears. The world looked the same as before, and yet not quite. Sometimes peace comes not because anything changes, but because you finally let the moment settle where it belongs. Inside, the she poured herself a little water from the jug and drank, the chill of it grounding. On the shelf, a small clay pot caught her eye. The one Lee had brought home last spring after his first long assignment away. She reached out, tracing the edge of it with her thumb. Dust had settled there, fine and even. She smiled, then set it upright again, a simple act of keeping something the lamp flickered once when she lit it. Its light spread across the room, painting the walls in soft amber. Outside, the wind had calmed. The night air pressed gently against the glass, and the reflection of her own face merged with the Sam sat down on the wooden chair beside the window. The stillness of the house wrapped around her like a familiar coat. She closed her eyes and let the weight of the day slip off, one breath at a time. She thought of Lee, the way his eyes had looked that night, the night he told her what she already knew, but hadn't dared name. His words weren't polished or rehearsed. They were quiet, almost shy, but they had stayed. She could still remember how the world outside had been full of rain then, the sound of it running off the roof, pooling near the steps, whispering against the fields. He had stood there, soaked to the bone, a half smile on his lips. "I don't know what comes next," he'd said, but now as she sat in the calm of her little home, that memory felt close enough to touch. It was both ache and comfort. Love, she realized, was rarely loud. It lived in gestures, in soil, tended before sunrise, in the patience of waiting, in the soft promise of someone's voice breaking through static, just to say, I'm here." She let her gaze drift toward the window again. Beyond the faint reflection, she could see the garden path, silvered by the moonlight beginning to rise. The saplings Duke had placed earlier stood like small shadows, thin and brave. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once Sam reached for the folded scarf on the back of the chair. Lee's old one, frayed at the ends. She wrapped it around her shoulders and felt its worn warmth against her skin. The scent of it, faint smoke, a trace of iron, maybe soap, was something she hadn't noticed in weeks. For a while, she simply sat there, holding her cup, eyes half closed. The lamplight trembled softly with the wind's rhythm. Every sound in the room seemed meaningful. The slow tick of cooling metal, the creak of wood, the faint shift of air through cracks that had learned to be kind. When she finally moved, it was only to stand and draw the curtain halfway, leaving just enough space for the moon to look in. She whispered, "Good night," not sure to whom. Maybe to the house, maybe to Lee, maybe to the waiting itself. The garden beyond shimmered faintly under the thin light. The hens were asleep, feathers puffed, heads tucked. Life, in its quiet way, was continuing. Slow, imperfect, but steady. Sam turned down the lamp and watched the last ember of its flame fade into darkness. She lay down and pulled the blanket to her chin, listening to the steady rhythm of the wind outside. The house creaked once, as if to remind her she wasn't alone. In that quiet, she thought again of Lee's voice. "Wait for me." And she would. But tonight, waiting didn't feel like longing anymore. It felt like peace. Not every silence is empty. Some are the sound of life holding steady. Sam's garden still grows, her heart still waits, and the wind still carries Lee's name. Whatever walks out of the dark, she will face it with quiet grace.